So I'm going to do two. I'm going to do two PowerPoint presentations with you very quickly. I actually did a bit of a speechy thing, but I don't think it's going to be relevant in this setting. But I'll do two PowerPoint presentations, and I'll go through them pretty quickly, so we have some time for questions. But I wanted to start off with something that clearly does impact on perception. Whether the newspapers want to tell you that it doesn't, it actually clearly does, because what you read will change your perception. It's just as simple and as basic as that. And so, one of the areas we need to look at in the wide or kind of globalized response, particularly in the UK, to anti-Muslim hatred, is to look at the coverage of the media and how it actually represents both Muslims and Islam, and the kind of framing of both of those areas within our social spheres. And so I want to just talk about, so this is just a statement we've put up there. News frames help journalists tell stories and report events that form a coherent narrative. I want you to focus on the words coherent narrative here. Okay, it helps audiences understand why certain stories are important, their context and their origins. Selection and exclusion will happen. It's not always a bad thing. They also help with the manipulation of stories. So focus on the coherent narrative and focus on they also help with the manipulation of stories in what I'm going to show you in the presentation. So we have two different distinct areas. That is journalistic press reporting on facts and journalistic press reporting on creating a story. Two different areas, two different very distinct areas. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little poll that took place. The poll that took place really has looked at different commissions, more right-wing centred, left-wing centred commissions, independent commissions, looking at 4 themes they asked about in 14 Muslim public opinion polls. What you'll find is, they've looked at a whole variety of areas, and what is really important, particularly in relation to Muslim communities, pretty strongly, was also the issue of political freedoms. Now, I think within that you can encompass a range of things. Particularly, you would probably find that the prevent agenda is probably couched within the political freedom element. You're looking at civil liberties couched in the political freedom element. You're looking at personal responsibility, possibly some issues of judicial system and sentencing that may be particularly framed in the political freedoms area, but it is significant. A lot of Muslims felt that civil liberties, maybe around the prevent agenda, all these key things were impacting potentially on them, stop and search, etc. So you've got quite a high figure in that area. You've also got foreign policy as a concern. Clearly, you've got some issues of less around security and some issues there, particularly in a right-wing commission, that are focused on integration. What I'm trying to show you is that basically in the summation of these kind of polls, what seems to come out are some key areas that are consistently pushed: the issues of integration and the issues of security, and to some degree other press sources like The Guardian will pick up on issues of foreign policy. What I'm trying to show you is how the political right and the political left split around how they ask and conduct polling within Muslim communities. So foreign policy and looking at the impacts of foreign policy, looking at the issues of civil liberties, will be more on the political left of the opinion polls and the frames. Issues of security and integration will be more on the political right of the opinion polls. So how you ask your questions and how you frame them in the political landscape and the political lens you have will clearly affect how you're going to produce, or how you're going to create your set of results. Okay, how you're going to create them is clearly influenced by you asking the questions, clearly influenced by your political steer of where you're going. Okay, so many of these polls, are not definitive. They have different influencing factors as to how you reach your set of opinions at the end. Now, I thought I was coming to Cardiff, so I might include the Cardiff School of Journalism. A study that analysed 974 stories in 2008 and found this: the vast majority of stories around Muslim communities are around terrorism, religious and cultural issues. By the way, the religious and cultural issues are things like Muslim communities separating men and women, segregation, etc., etc. You're not talking about positive religious and cultural issues here. You're looking at, segregation. You're looking at issues of having probably concerns about gender, and that's the way those are framed. So quite in a negative slant. You're looking at issues around Muslim extremism as also a high figure within journalistic reporting. And what you have is a tiny number around issues of concern that may be quite relevant to Muslim communities, things like Islamophobia. So the framing of the Muslim community is predominantly negative if it's seen through the eyes of terrorism, and seen negatively through religious and cultural issues, and then seen through extremism, which is placed within Muslim communities. So that's the frame by which, and the framework by which this study came to the conclusion that, overwhelmingly a lot of these press stories are quite negative. So just to put some statements out here. So what, this researcher said at the University of Manchester, she found that people receive a true picture of what Muslims think, mainly comes from an artifact of what they get asked. So what you ask them, like any member of the public, will produce a response. And that the non-Muslims' answer to similar questions actually produces similar responses. So this is nothing distinct about Muslim communities. You ask the question in a certain way, you'll get a certain response. And it's relevant in Muslim communities, and it's relevant within non-Muslim communities. And so, I've given you an example here, pushing towards the fact that these newspaper opinion polls that are provided will have a political slant, will have a journalistic slant, will have certainly an element of the questions that are being asked and the themes that are being pulled out and teased. Okay? So let me go on to what you get and what some of the framing around Muslim communities is. And within the context of my discussion today, I'm laying down the ground as to why there are certain factors that may be relevant in our discussion today. And clearly the media is one of them. It is felt very strongly within Muslim communities, and I'll show you potentially why. So you get this kind of headline: Muslims tell us how to run our schools. Another one around extremism. Sniffer dogs offend Muslims. Okay. Right, Muslim schools ban our culture. I've never in my life actually seen that take place. How do you where do you start with culture? What elements of culture, what bits of culture are you talking about? So these are just some of the framed elements of the press that we have picked up. And what you start to see from this gorgeous paper, the Daily Express, is a range of headlines that frame Muslims in trying to subvert culture. Both of these are around subversion of culture and enforcement of a different type of culture. What you have, and the third one, what you have, the fourth is extremism, and fifth is basically saying you can't integrate, you're no part of society. Okay? So, in other words, you're not really British. Okay, they can't fit in. They can't fit into society. They're having a go at us. They want to be different. Recently, one that was seen in The Sun, that was, I think, in relation to the Channel 4's broadcast of an azan. Do you remember that? Yeah. Okay. Jihad seekers allowance, makes a spin on job seekers allowance. I think it's quite clever, actually, some of these. I've got to give it to them. They do come out with some clever stuff. Muslim thugs aged just 12 in knife attack on Brit schoolboy. Okay, there's a framing of them, us, different. Ramadan a ding dong, completely different. Culture is completely different. Doesn't belong here, belongs to the Middle East. A very strong sense of that coming through. Brit kids forced to eat halal school dinners, so something inherently bizarre, twisted and different to this community, again being pushed through. Infuriate no-go areas, Muslim-only public loos. Did you see that one? Yeah, Muslim-only public loos. I've never been to one. I'd love to try it out, actually. I wonder what the difference is. Maybe the urinals are in a different location or something along those lines. Who knows? Who knows? Norway's 9/11. So, here we have a consistent, I'm just showing you some of the key things we've picked up, a consistent stream of press reporting. But within that, there are some real challenges, and those real challenges are around extremism, which are impacting on Muslim communities. We can't get away from the fact that this happened on our streets. We can't get away from the fact that this was actually reported on with quite a lot of debate as to whether they should put this picture up or not. In the end, many of the newspapers ran it. So in some of these areas, there is journalistic reporting which is factual. It's happened, it's real, it's raw, it's terrible, it's on our streets. And then the other side, the caricaturing, which I've just shown you in relation to Muslim communities as a whole. Now, just to give you another example in relation to a story that happened recently, which shows that some of these stories are just factually incorrect, completely without basis, but they are run and they have community impacts. This took place, I think, in 2014 in Edmonton in North London, where a Muslim convert, it says Muslim, it wasn't, where an individual effectively beheaded a senior citizen who was doing some gardening. It was a terrible, terrible issue. Clearly a murder took place, a nasty murder. This was the headline that was run by The Sun: Muslim convert beheads woman in garden. Okay, that was run in September 2014. This is the individual, this is the same paper running the story the next day. Comment says CCTV showed the Muslim convert dubbed Fat Nick. Okay, so this is the next report, next day's reporting, 2 days worth of reporting in relation to this very, very heinous crime, where the individual, they're clearly suggesting, is a Muslim convert. Go back to this newspaper report, which is 8 months later, June the 15th, 2015. What do you find in the facts? He had converted to Islam in 2012 and found Buddhism last year in 2014, but had apparently ditched religion before his rampage. So this person clearly had no faith because of his choice, had changed religions before, and at the time of the murder was clearly not a Muslim convert. Clearly not a Muslim convert, from the same paper 8 months later. Okay? What they also failed to tell you is the individual suffered from severe schizophrenia. Those are the two impacts that went out on their publications on those 2 days. Factually inaccurate. No relevance to the headline, but included in the paper and in 2 publications that went out. As I said, the reality: Nicolas Salvador suffered paranoid schizophrenia, was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. Okay? But the suggestion is he is an ISIS-type individual, that Islam or some form of being Muslim may have influenced him. Detained indefinitely in a psychiatric hospital. Okay? So there's a prime example of a newspaper that by its own submission actually puts out the facts that it was, spinning the story. Effectively spinning the story. So, we go on, and we go on. I think that was the recent one we saw. Halalbert Square. BBC building mosque on new £15 million soap set. Terrible. End of the world. My God, taxpayers' money from the BBC. So this is the daily diet of stuff that is out there that continues on. Okay, so a couple of points I want to put out here. Media representations which focus on cultural difference sometimes reflect deeper anxieties within society. Okay, so what we are seeing, by the way, I don't believe is that editors of these papers wake up with an ideological slant to be anti-Muslim or Islamophobic. I don't believe that that's the case. What I believe is the case is that these newspapers understand that there are some sections within society where this message resonates. And in the end, by resonating with those sections in society, they will make their sales. It's as simple as that. So I don't believe these editors are saying, we don't like Muslims, we're going to print this material. What they are doing is quite cleverly understanding their target market and understanding the market where there are anxieties in the population, and all they're doing is filling that gap and playing to that market. We need to understand that they are cleverly understanding their market and they're cleverly understanding their target populations. Okay? But what we also know from the work we do is Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate has a latent effect. Okay? It sits deeper in society and it starts to have an impact on day-to-day interactions. How do we know that? Through the language of what is said to victims. The latency of Islamophobia is there. You will see it in the language, and I'll show it to you how the language shifts and changes and adapts. Okay? That's why, in a way, we've listed here Islamophobia, and this is important. Doesn't feel like it, when somebody says something to you, it doesn't feel that it's an alien concept in terms of the words that are used. That there is some sense of a lived experience. There is some sense that those words have been picked up from some experience locally, nationally, or even internationally. So there are influencing factors along the way. Okay, newspapers are one. Terrorist incidences beyond our shores are another, but there are other factors. So these are lived experiences. These are issues that people are absorbing and actually then in many instances targeting towards members of the Muslim community. And the last thing to say here really is that newspapers reflect not only the aspirations of their readers, but also, and I go back to this again, the anxieties of their readers. So I'm going to say this, and it might be controversial. These papers are effectively knowing their audience really well. Okay, so in our society, there is a section in our society which has these deep anxieties around Muslim communities. And these papers are simply, in many instances, playing to that. So, when we look at a discourse, an analysis of Islamophobic hate crime data from the Met Police from October 2008 to 2009, we found that about 31% of incidences were aggravated. Which means, it didn't initially start off with Islamophobic sentiments. So these were 31% of cases during that time period, did not start off with somebody targeting a member of the Muslim community. They started off with some kind of altercation. They started off with some kind of discussion. They started off with some kind of debate. And what happened is the Islamophobic rhetoric kicked in after the initial engagement between individuals. Why is this important? Because you've got to see Islamophobia in the light of two different and two distinct areas. One is a latency factor, where in the back of the mind there are perceptions which during a debate discussion or even a heated debate and discussion will come out. There's a latent effect. That's what I'm showing you. They'll come out. And there are those individuals who will directly target members of the Muslim community who are, inherently anti-Muslim by nature. But it is this latency which comes out, and we have seen it. We've seen it in schools where two mothers who have seen each other, have said hi to each other, will probably get into a parking dispute because one mum wants to get in and she can't get in. A simple thing like a parking dispute turns into an Islamophobic incident. Why is that? We would argue the fact of this latency, this inherent thought process that has been influenced by things around the individual within the living environment of themselves. So 27%, nearly as high, so 27% of incidences were premeditated. The individual, the perpetrator, instigated the Islamophobic incident. They directly targeted somebody. They didn't engage with them. They just directly targeted individuals. There is also a nature within the premeditated factor of what we call opportunistic Islamophobic hate incidences. And the opportunistic Islamophobic hate incidences are again within that kind of lived environment. So a woman walking down the street with a hijab, somebody sees them, they have an opportunity to say something, they'll say something. Really fits into the premeditated area rather than the aggravated area. Okay, so we've got this aggravated area which starts, it's nothing said, but something will trigger it. This one, direct targeting. And within the direct targeting, there is an opportunistic element. So they see it, there's an opportunity, they'll take it, they'll say something. And what we also found is that a vast majority of incidences happen in public places. So if somebody says, where does Islamophobia happen? The answer is all around you. Okay, the answer is all around you. Because actually it's the public spaces where these incidences are taking place. If you then further drill down, you'll find that actually 1/3 in our data after the Paris murders, we found within the 2 weeks after the Paris terrorist murders this year, within those 2 weeks after it, that nearly 1/3 of incidences took place on public transport. 1/3 of incidences predominantly focusing on Muslim women, predominantly focusing on visible Muslim women, took place on public transport. So if somebody really says, where is Islamophobia? It's all around you in the public sphere. It's in the public environment. It can happen in public spaces. We find that in public transport. Okay, it's not hidden away in corners. There are some sectors which are affected. The taxi industry is affected. We can see some marked areas. The late night catering industry, the kebab owners are affected. Most of that is alcohol driven. Most of that is on a Friday, Saturday. People have drunk too much. Kebab's not on time. Boom. Aggravated element comes out. Yeah? Where's my kebab? It's 2 minutes late. Well, can you wait, sir? No, I can't wait, you effing. Aggravated. So you can start to see the different segmentation of how Islamophobia is affecting communities. But the main thing, it happens in the public environment, around you. Okay? Can you all see that? The text is pretty small. Okay, so I'll hopefully circulate this slide. I mean, this slide basically says, in a poll that was done, a survey done in 2015, there is more likely to be a clash of civilizations between native white Britons and Muslims. Very high marked population. You can see a clear, distinct difference with other faith communities. So the perception here around the British public when they've been asked this question is actually the issues of integration are significantly fractured with Muslim communities. That's what they're saying. In other words, they're saying they don't fit in. They're not fitting into society. They're not being part of society. This is concerning. Clearly the issue of integration is concerning here. Again, British values, this framing around British values where 46% of the population are saying actually Muslims not only are not well integrated, they don't accept our values, not their values. Okay? So before I go on to the other slide, I just want to give you an example of another really mendacious article. That's the only word I'm going to use about it. It's a real mendacious article. So this was published in the Mail on Sunday. Welcome to East London. Welcome to East London. Notice the starting point. Muslim gang slashes tire of immigration raid van before officers showered with eggs from high rise. What impression does that give you? East London's out of control. What it's trying to say to you, the Muslims are out of control, they've got a gang-style environment within East London. That's what it's saying just in the title. Okay, we don't even have to extrapolate, it's there. There's the title change after they've been pulled up for their article. There was no Muslim gang. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, they've been pulled up, somebody's complained, there's been an investigation, ipso complaint, I think it was. The article suddenly changes. Okay, but the impact of that has already been circulated. Okay? It was an ipso complaint, correct. So an ipso complaint led to this correction and clarification. An article on July 26 said a gang of Muslim youths was responsible for damaging Home Office immigration enforcement. Muslim readers have asked to point out that the youth's religion was unclear and in any case irrelevant to the story. We apologise for any offence caused because we've been caught with our pants down, frankly. That's it, in a nutshell. We've been caught. So we changed the headline, but the impact is already there when that was circulated. Okay? So, last couple of slides. I'm going to just go back to this reframing. Okay, we now have a different dynamic kicking in. We have seen a different dynamic kicking in. Sex grooming has been a huge dynamic around Islamophobic discourse. Huge dynamic. And the caricaturing of the Muslim male, the kind of barbaric, can't control his impulses, uncontrollable sexual urges is the new framing post Rotherham and Rochdale. Now the sad fact is there were members of the Pakistani community, British Muslim Pakistani community involved. But what it has to do with Islam and being Muslim is there's no link, frankly. Okay, but the framing of the papers is pretty clear. Okay. As I said, integration, but also demographics is playing a very strong part. So what they're saying is they breed too much. They breed too much, can't control their sexual urges, they want their own values, they won't integrate. Now tell me how this is positive. And this, what I'm showing you, this is not just the Daily Mail. What I'm showing you, it's not just the papers you probably might expect some headlines. This is a serious journalistic paper. Yeah? And so we go on. And so the reality is today, in terms of Islamophobic discourse, the grooming scandals have created a whole language and a whole unique set of, I would say, Islamophobic discourse that relates to these grooming incidences. And again, as I said, very difficult when there are individuals who are involved, who come from or have Pakistani heritage involved in those incidences. The last couple of items, Muslims silent on terror. Do you remember that one? I think you did a great tweet, if I remember.
I tweet a lot.
I think you did a great tweet on that one, and it was something Cameron said, and you kind of, it'll come to me. So here's a change in the Times. Here's a change in the Times reporting. Okay. So the first one says Muslims silent on terror. Completely different meaning. Completely different meaning. And this was around a scheme on Channel. This was around Channel and the prevent strategy, where what the paper was trying to say is that there is less engagement from Muslim communities and there is less referrals from Muslim communities into the prevent scheme around Channel nationally. That's what it was trying to say. Now, if it framed it like that, it's a perfectly legitimate article you can write to say, you know, less engagement, less referrals, will it have an impact? Who knows? You could write a general, very good journalistic piece, but that is completely different to what the actual facts were. That was then changed after it was reported to IPSO. Look at the hugely distinctive change in the same article, in the same paper. Okay? So, just to finish off by saying, sorry, I'm going to show you this because this is important. Okay, after the Paris Charlie Hebdo massacre. After the Charlie Hebdo massacre, what's the problem with this article? What's the problem with that paper? I should have closed that. What's the problem with that? Sorry? North African Muslim. Okay. Well, actually, if you look at it, there are two people who may be purporting to be in the name of Islam, but he's a Muslim guy. All right? It doesn't fit the frame of that picture. All right? This is what I'm saying about how the newspapers frame what they are putting out there at a section of the population in the public they believe will buy up these anxieties, or who have these anxieties rather, and who actually accept these anxieties. Okay, so this is part of the problem. This is part of the problem. And to be honest and to be fair, the Star, I've got to give credit where credit's due, actually put up the right headline. Okay, the Star put up the right headline. So, you know, this is not about they hate Islam or they hate Muslims. This is really, to some degree, sometimes they're pretty good. This is about anxieties that are being played out. Okay, so I won't go through the other bits, which were a quarter of Muslims sympathise with Charlie Hebdo terrorists. That was a very recent one. But I actually, this one has to be shown because this was really recent. You saw this one?
Yes.
Yeah? It just baffles me what is going on here. I mean, that says it all. That was changed. That was changed because of a lot of revulsion on social media. A lot of revulsion on social media. And I know the Greater Manchester Chief Constable wrote to the paper, and that was changed. Again, what has it got to do with sex grooming? Nothing whatsoever. Okay? Nothing whatsoever. Obviously, Rochdale MP Simon Danczuk also wrote in relation to that. So what can you do? Look, IPSO is not the best and the most ideal of organisations in relation to getting what you may want in relation to changes on articles, but it is the best thing out there right now. And so, you know, I would suggest very clearly that if you see inaccuracies on fact, then I would ask you and urge you to complain to IPSO in relation to these kind of articles and press articles you've seen. Okay, so IPSO, have a read of the code of practice, the editor's code of practice, have a read, go through it, get to understand it, and if you see any of these articles or you think there's actually factual inaccuracy in them, report into IPSO, log a report into IPSO, and they will have to at least come and look at it and then come back to you with a statement. Okay, so it's really important that this takes place. Right, any questions on that before I move on to my next PowerPoint slides? Okay, I just got 10 minutes, so I'm going to whip through this, but I want to tell you, look, so I've talked about the media, but there are other areas that are of concern. Other areas of concern are institutional issues. Okay, institutional issues are of concern. They mainly affect and impact on Muslim men. So there are some gender issues here. Most of the people who report in issues of institutional prejudice, which they perceive, are usually Muslim males. Now, what's the reason for that? I'm not sure. We need more work done on that, but it's mostly males that are affected. Schools are being affected. How are schools being affected? Because those incidences with the parking that take place, okay, the aggravated issues that come out. How are schools also being affected? Now, this is very, very tricky stuff, and this is how the prevent agenda is also impacting on this area. Really tricky stuff. So, you know, I'm not going to go into whether counter-extremism is good or bad. That's not my role. I think we need a counter-extremism strategy. It's important. But let's park that there. The fact of the matter is we're getting Muslim families who are saying, my child is being picked upon, my child is being asked questions. Now, whether that is right or wrong, whether that is done with due care or not, I'm not going to get in that argument. The fact is the perception of Islamophobia is starting to take root around some of the counter-extremism strategy. The perception is taking root, okay? And this is really difficult to untangle because, you know, some of the time when we write to schools, they have a clear logical answer. When you write to other schools, you find that actually they've overreacted. They've overreacted. So it's a really entangled mesh of perception, reality and unreality in relation to this area. But we've put it in there because these things are happening and they're happening in schools and we're being reported into by parents. Okay? We know that most of the stuff is street-based. We've talked about opportunistic nature of them. But I also want to talk about the fact that we have huge gender issues around Islamophobia, huge gender issues. As I talked about males being affected in the workplace, reason why, I don't know. We know that visibility is a huge factor in street-based Islamophobia. It is the engine and the generator for street-based Islamophobia. So you need to see street-based Islamophobia in two ways. You need to see it as not only religiously aggravated in its nature, but you need to see street-based Islamophobia as male on female abuse. It's male on female abuse. That's the way you've got to frame it, because it is. The vast majority of the perpetrators are male. The vast majority and overwhelming majority of the victims are female. If you look at anti-Semitism, it reverses. If you look at anti-Semitism at a street level, it is mainly Jewish males who wear the kippah, who are visible. If you look at Islamophobia at a street level, it is mainly visible Muslim women. So there's a distinct difference actually between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in gender. Okay, men, women. Most of the perpetrators male, most of the perpetrators between the ages of 15 to 35, mainly white males. So this is quite, there's a sheer hypocrisy of this, because many of the times they will say to Muslim women, you know, Islam does not have any women's rights, but you've got a man abusing a woman at a street level. There is a kind of a disconnect. There's a sense of disconnect within the perpetrators as to what they're doing. Okay? And the other factor is, which is rather bizarre, is converts to Islam say to us there's a racialization in the language that is said to them. So converts to Islam will usually hear terms that relate to being Pakistani. Right? So they will say, you know, why don't you go back to Pakistan? And the woman is born and bred and lived here and she's white. So there is something about the hijab, which they relate to being of Pakistani heritage, which is completely alien in their mindset. So this is really important, because the racialization element within Islamophobia versus the anti-Muslim bigotry is actually linked. Okay, this is really, really important stuff. Why? I'll tell you why. Because when it comes down to police reporting, this is where it becomes very error-filled. Okay? So we know that there's a racialization. We know that even with white converts, they say, you know, go back to Pakistan, you're a Taliban, whatever. The fact of the matter is, when you have a police officer at the front desk who suddenly gets somebody come to them and says, look, I've been called this and I've been called an effing P, I can tell you a lot of officers will say, right, that's a racial crime. What they'll miss out is the other contextual basis of the religiously aggravated incident in there. And this happens time and time again. So the classification of the case is wrong or partially right. Not only is the classification just partially right, they will be missing out on evidence that relates to the religiously aggravated offence. So it has implications. Because if you go to court on one element, you're missing the possibility of further sentencing on the other element. You're missing on the context of what a judge can say is actually, this guy's just a bad dude. He's not good. Because look at all these bits he's brought into play. This is important because it affects sentencing. It affects sentencing. I'm not going to go into sentencing because I've just been so angry at some of the stuff I see where judges and sentencing is related to far-right activists who frankly get peanuts of sentences. Okay, so, but there's a whole different gamut to talk about there. But what I'm saying is, the reality is racialization and Islamophobia are linked. Okay, so racial terms directly linked. 5 minutes, brilliant, right, okay. So, what we found is also, and this is when we started off, is most of the incidences that took place online. So there's a heavy bias online in relation to Islamophobia. And we've called this, we've used the term background noise. It's this kind of background hum in relation to social media and Islamophobia. But I've said this before in a talk. The fact of the matter is, most of the online incidences we picked up early on and continue to pick up they have a huge far-right link right in the heart of them. Okay, so this is why it's important to hammer home the fact that the internet becomes a loudspeaker, a megaphone for some of the extreme groups, because they use the internet to magnify and amplify their message. So a small number of individuals from the far right can amplify their message, and you can see the impact of their actions right the way across. Nearly 7 out of 10 cases in the online world have a link to the far right. So this is the important factor to pick up from that. I talked about perpetrator base. I said 15 to 35 on average. It's 15 to 35. In that year, it was 10 to 30. 10-year-olds involved in circulating far-right material. So like any group which is promoting extremism, youngsters will be affected, who are vulnerable, who don't understand the context, will be affected and pick up this material. And in that year, 2/5, nearly 40% of the incidences had a link to the far right. So the far right is punching well above its weight in relation to impacts on Muslim communities and Islamophobia. But what I'm just going to do is just to tell you, you don't have to go through this whole thing, but just to say, look, national incidences around terrorism are also buffeting Muslim communities. The problem here in Islamophobia is you've got so many incidences buffeting Muslim communities. So many. If you look at anti-Semitism, you will have the Middle East will buffet Jewish communities. So something that happens in Gaza will have a direct impact on the spike of anti-Semitic incidences here. The problem with the Muslim community here is that it's dealing with tens of incidences that are buffeting it. If it's not ISIS, it's the grooming scandal. If it's not the grooming scandal, it's the far right being active in areas like during the general election. If it's not the far right, it's Charlie Hebdo murders. If it's not Charlie Hebdo murders, it's the Paris incidences and murders. And Tunisia murders. I can go on. Each one of them is creating huge spikes in Islamophobic discourse and incidences. And that's creating tremors in us. In many ways, it's creating tremors in our society. Okay, in a way, it's creating larger amplitudes and waves of incidences that are taking place. 2 minutes. So, very quickly, after the murder of Lee Rigby, we had 34 mosques in 3 months attacked. Okay, so we had to track down numbers, we had to go through numbers. 34 mosques after the murder of Lee Rigby were attacked. We didn't hear that anywhere. That's 10 a month. That's 10 a month, that's nearly 1 a week. When you start to map out the incidences, you start to see how local and national incidences and international incidences spike and cluster these issues across the country. Okay? So it really is quite stark. And if I then go on to the fact that if you then start to map out and chart since 7/7 the rise in Islamophobic hate crimes, and this is on Met data, so we've even gone external and brought in external data to see whether we are validated, you find this. There we go. That is a stark realization that every incident is creating these huge spikes in Islamophobic hate crimes. I'm not even talking about incidences. These are crimes that are crimed now by Metropolitan Police Service. Okay? Look at the percentage rises across the board. And last, just to kick off, I talked about language. I've shown this before. This is something quite useful to show. So if we look at a time period and we look at the statements made to victims, we pick out the frequency of words made to victims. A minute? Have I got a minute? About a minute. I'll finish here. And you can start to see key words that are coming out. So you can see the rise of ISIS during that period of time. So ISIS is really high up. Okay? You can see the words that are related to ISIS very strong. You can see the racialization in the language. But what I'm trying to show you is how international incidences are really rapidly changing the language of Islamophobia. January, February 2015, Charlie Hebdo happens. Boom. Racialization is right in the heart of it. Terrorist. You can see the links between the words that are said to victims. You then go into the general election. Look at the racialization change, because the far-right groups are out there active handing out leaflets that we picked up. Can you see how the language of Islamophobia is shifting so fast? Okay? Tunisia, because of the Tunisia murders. ISIS is still there. And I'm going to finish with this slide. Just going to finish with this slide. We see this kind of stuff regularly. Okay, this is from a far-right. This is from a far-right group which puts out this material, and this group has really been active online. So, for many people who have some anxieties around the grooming scandal, they may get sucked into this. Okay, people with anxieties may say, actually, I live around Rotherham, we've had these issues, actually that resonates with me, so people can get sucked into this. But this is the kind of material we are seeing out there. This is quite good advice, but these bits tell you there is something fundamentally wrong about this graphic and probably the group behind it. But the reality is this is an extremist far-right group, and this kind of lack of trust in authority is part and parcel of the nature of extreme far-right groups. Lack of trust in authority, fear of authority, fear of the police. It doesn't help that the police were also implicated in that issue. But actually, this is the kind of material that's out there that is also having huge impacts in relation to perception, and which we find quite regularly in social media circles. I'm going to stop there.